Thank you for joining Not in the Handbook. Hello and welcome. This is a podcast that looks and explores organisational culture, workplace culture, and our mission is to create healthy, positive workplace cultures. And I'm delighted to have here our guest today, Ian Fraser, who wrote the book Shredded. I have it here. You talk about RBS, a really important book and really instrumental into the work of my book on toxic organisational cultures and leadership. So very warm welcome to you, Ian. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I want to kind of start really by perhaps just telling the audience about your professional journey to date. Just where have you come from as an author and as a journalist?
Right. Well, I have a degree from St Andrews University in English language and literature, which I suppose helped me to, make an argument or write succinctly. Then I actually worked in the advertising industry for about 5 years, starting in an agency in Edinburgh, which was part of Saatchi & Saatchi, and then worked for other agencies in Paris and in London, Paris, and then back in London. But it was only in about 1988 that I took up journalism, initially mainly as a freelance and writing about the advertising industry, which was what I knew and understood. But I was a regular. I wrote for a magazine called Campaign, which was then the advertising man's Bible and woman, advertising men and woman's Bible. They basically religiously read that every Thursday morning when it came out. And it was quite different from most trade mags. It basically broke the mold for trade mags. It actually took a more tabloid approach to the news of that sector. Anyway, I won't go through them all, but I worked for various magazines, including Euro Business as assistant editor, and then Unilever magazine, inside Unilever in Blackfriars, editing their in-house magazines and journals. And then I edited a magazine called Director, which is run by the Institute of Directors. And then an opportunity came to become the financial editor of a newspaper in Scotland called the Sunday Herald, which was just launching in 1999, because the Herald had been around for like 225 years or something, but had not had a Sunday equivalent, apart from a brief time in the 80s. So I was hired as the financial editor of that new paper, and that was one of the most exciting times of my life, of my professional life, because there was a lot of changes going on in the financial sector at that time, and my remit was to cover the banking sector and Royal Bank and HBOS. Within a few days of me, within a few months of me starting, were engaged in a fight to the death over whether one or other might buy National Westminster Bank. It started in September 1999 and ended in March 2000. And then I was also covering the asset management industry, and I was also covering the insurance industry. There was lots of changes going on in insurance, with all the old mutuals demutualizing and transforming into PLCs or being acquired by PLCs. So that was a very interesting time. Then in 2006, I went freelance, and then I helped to make about 10 documentaries for the BBC, mainly related to the financial crisis or linked to the financial crisis in some way or another. And then I worked as business editor of Sunday Times Scotland for a couple of years. And then after that, I wrote Shredded, actually. So writing this book took about 2 years, 2012 to 2014. And the book came out in 2014, but then there's been several new editions since then, so I've been updating it regularly. I've also taught journalism at the University of Stirling, and I was consultant editor for something called Q Finance, which was a massive project, which was a joint venture between Bloomsbury Publishing, the publishers of Harry Potter, and Qatar Financial Centre, which was a massive amount of work, actually. I had to commission scores of viewpoints from prominent thinkers like Joseph Stiglitz, prominent thinkers on economics. So or finance. So, top investment managers or top economists or professors of mathematics, or all sorts of different people who were commenting mainly on how to re-regulate the financial sector in the wake of the crash of '08. So those are the main things that.
That's so impressive. I mean, it's quite breathless actually when you talk about your career, and yes, amazing. So let's just focus on the book RBS. As you say, it took 2 years for you to do the research and write, and it's a very in-depth, comprehensive view around what happened with RBS, and you take that as a corporate history through it. So why did you write it, and why did you call it Shredded?
Okay. Well, basically, I'd met Fred Goodwin about 10 times between 99 and '08, before the crash. I think the last time I saw him was January 2008. As a financial editor, we went to the results, the annual results or half-year results. I also met him at 1 or 2 dinners and things like that. So I was familiar with Fred Goodwin and with the Royal Bank of Scotland. Had quite a lot of contacts at other levels inside the bank who I'd come across over the years. And I just felt that after the bank collapsed and needed one of the biggest bailouts in history in October 2008, that people might want to know, why have we spent 45.6 billion on saving this bank? Why did it need saving? And what was it that caused its demise? Because you might also argue that the collapse of RBS and other banks were one of the reasons we went through 12 years of austerity, and one of the reasons why we had Brexit potentially, and also one of the reasons why populist parties are so popular nowadays. I felt that people might be interested in knowing the seeds of its collapse. What was actually going on inside the bank, which had caused it to require the largest bailout in history. So
before we kind of delve into kind of what happened about RBS, maybe just get your own perspective, because many people would talk about RBS and label it as a toxic culture, toxic workplace culture. Would you define it as that? Would you, in summary, would you go back and look at that and say, oh yeah, I think it was a toxic workplace culture? And if that's the case, what do you think were the telltale signs?
I don't think it was toxic across the board, but I think people who worked closely with Fred Goodwin did suffer. Some of them suffered enormously because he was a very difficult man to work with. He was a bit of a tyrant, a bit of an egomaniac, and maybe slightly narcissistic. And I can mention one person called Jo Davidson, who was the head of corporate and social responsibility. And she's actually the daughter of a former chairman of Royal Bank of Scotland called George Younger. She's sadly no longer with us, but he made her life absolute hell. She would write the CSR report, which was to accompany the annual report. So it comes out, I suppose, in about April, May, when the AGM happens. But he would go through it with a I don't know what color pen, but possibly red, and basically say, this is pish, P-I-S-H. And, she actually spent a lot of time putting this thing together, and it probably was perfectly good, but he just ripped it to shreds. And she suffered enormously because of that. That's just one example.
In fact, I mentioned an example like that in my book of a colleague in the reward function who had exactly that experience with pish put in the margins.
Yes. Well, it's not a good way of managing a large enterprise. And, one of the things that I discovered, particularly during the research for the program back in 2009 to 2011, was these things called the morning beatings, where he would single out one senior executive for so-called shredding. And, this once happened to Miller McLean, who was then the company secretary and had been company secretary under the previous regime of George Matheson. And he was just absolutely stunned by it and was seen walking around St Andrew's Square in a daze afterwards because, this sort of thing had never happened to him before. So
So the telltale signs we were saying is that, language that was used, criticism, written criticism,
yes.
plus also verbal criticism, as you said, the morning meetings were nicknamed the morning beatings,
yes.
because someone would be called out and they would be chastised in front of all their colleagues,
yes.
and blamed for whatever had happened in the last few days.
Yes.
So
and maybe this is all part of a thing like pour encourager les autres in French, which is, if you make someone's life hell or even hang them, as in the Candide story where it originates from, I'm not saying they were hanged, but the others will be careful and work and make sure they don't mistakes and work harder. That may have been the thinking behind it.
Mm. And when you came in to write the book, and you said you met with 100 or so senior executives through the organisation, how did you experience the workplace culture? What did you come in as an observer? What did you see? You heard these stories, but how did you experience the culture? I ask you that because you talk one part about the fear culture in the book.
Well, I was just like recording it, as taking notes, and I was doing tape recordings, but I wasn't necessarily experiencing it directly. But I do know people who did leave the bank in about 2002. Several people who left the bank between about 2002 and 2005, simply because they found it was going in the wrong direction, and they found Fred Goodwin impossible to work with. There are several people who, I think they're quite glad now because A, they got out when they did, but also they sold their shares because some of them had large holdings of RBS shares or share options. And so they, sold them when they were worth £21 instead of 10p. So some of those people were, obviously they were not good sources on what had happened since 2002 or 2005 or whenever they left. But they were pretty good on the time between Fred's arrival in August '98 and their own departures from the bank. But my experience of the culture, my own experience of the culture happened really as a financial journalist, mainly between about 1999 and 2008, when you were given bollockings by the head of the press office or the public affairs director. One of the people we dealt with was a man called Howard Moody, and he made threats. If you're going to write a certain story, he would issue threats, verbal threats that he would sue the paper I was working for, the Sunday Herald. So there was a culture there which I found different from almost any other company I wrote about. I do mention one particular incident, which was when one of his colleagues in the press office had responded to a request for information, which was to comment on a negative investment analyst report about RBS being too exposed to commercial property in about 2005, I think. And she came back with a quote, or she gave me a quote. She said, which was perfectly good. It was disputing the findings of the investment analyst. But then about 10 p.m. that night, I got a phone call from Howard Moody, the Northern Irish head of head of comms, and he said, "Can you take that out? We don't comment on analyst reports," which I thought quite odd because she had spoken to me. She was his colleague. She had given me a response, so it was like black is white or black. He was trying to say black is white.
You talk about
she had commented.
You talk about 1984 and groupthink, about that whole black and white piece. That in the end, you look at the colour white and you have to call it black because that's so that you talk around.
It's quite Orwellian, really.
Yes, and that's an interesting piece that how you experienced on the culture. So,
and by the way, there were several times when the Royal Bank of Scotland under Fred Goodwin tried to sue newspapers. They tried to sue the Sunday Herald, the one I worked for, over something another journalist there had written, accusing Fred Goodwin of lying. And they also tried to sue the Sunday Times over the Proofrock columns, which were mainly about the construction of Gogarburn, about the scallop kitchen, the road to the airport, the private road to the airport, and there was also one about Fred Goodwin being refused membership of a golf club. So yeah, they were quite litigious with the media, and I think
that was unusual. You
Yes.
say that was really, out of all the organisations and the banks and the financial organisations that you were dealing with, RBS was unique in
Yes.
that litigious, absolutely suing. If the story came out, didn't like it, they would sue
Yes.
or threaten to sue.
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, what I'd like to do is move on then and talk
Okay.
about what I call the toxic triangle, or what's in the book around toxic triangle, that you can't have just a toxic leader without having susceptible followers. And we can talk a bit more about what those are, plus a conducive environment. And we'll talk about performance management. And you mention a lot around the book around rank and yank as performance management. But I want to talk about the leader piece first. Because I'm going to just read this because I think, if the listeners read anything around this, because you state, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase if you might,
Yes.
you state that Fred Goodwin is deeply culpable for what happened to RBS, given he was CEO from 2000 to 2008. And you say, if he had run the bank differently, been less blind to risk, if he hadn't pushed for rapid growth and had not bought parts of ABN AMRO to assuage the Santander boss, and had not crushed any internal dissent, then RBS might not have failed. A lot to unpack in that. So, so perhaps we could go back to where you came in at 99, 2000, with the opportunity to acquire NatWest. And Fred Goodwin, relatively new, came in as Deputy CEO. I think his label or the job title had been given to him.
I think he had two titles. I think he was Deputy Chief Executive and Finance Director.
Yes.
Yeah.
But seen to be the heir apparent, all of this going on at the time. You also note in the book that RBS had been relatively undervalued at the point of acquisition. There was a lot more richness within the organisation than had been really believed to have been. But RBS capitalised on this. It set Fred Goodwin up to be perhaps the leader that he became, but we can talk a bit more about that. But one of the notable pieces was slashing headcount that almost went unnoticed in the press at the time. 18,000.
Yeah, it's 1/3 of the NatWest workforce.
Okay.
I think.
Yes, 18,000. I think they had about 60,000. According to Google, when I researched it the other day, was around as I say, 1/3. And the integrations, particularly IT or the systems, will not seem to be very successful post those times. So
Yes.
I wonder if you could just comment about how far you think the NatWest acquisition set Fred Goodwin up or defined him as the leader that he became.
Well, I think it was instrumental, really, because the takeover was the largest banking acquisition in history up until that point, I believe. I need to double check if that's UK or globally, but I think it's probably globally. And everyone says that Fred Goodwin handled the build-up to that in terms of presentations to investment analysts and investors incredibly well. Everyone I've spoken to, including some of the investors who were in the meetings, say he was just head and shoulders above anyone at the Bank of Scotland, which was fighting RBS for NatWest. He had an incredible head for figures, and he'd done a huge amount of work in terms of he and his team done a huge amount of work in terms of crunching the numbers as to how they would make this takeover work in practice. So he certainly won a lot of kudos for that. And I think then what followed between March 2000 and 2003, when the deal was fully integrated, when the NatWest acquisition was fully integrated, was also widely regarded as, widely perceived as being an exceptional banking integration, in terms of setting up these manufacturing centers, in terms of being quite ruthless in closing aspects of NatWest that they didn't want, in terms even of their decision to run two brands, because some people had thought they might just run one brand across the UK afterwards, but they didn't. They ran two retail brands, NatWest in England and Wales, and Royal Bank of Scotland in Scotland. And it was praised to the rooftops. I mean, there were numerous very positive reports about the integration of NatWest, which sung Fred's praises, like the Harvard Business School one, and just the way it was covered in the financial media at the time. And this was partly spin, because there was a lot of spin coming out of RBS press office saying that this had been an exemplary banking integration, and it had all gone perfectly. And actually, they were going to have more efficiency savings than they thought, and more additional revenue creation than they had thought. So it was all certainly perceived at that time as an exemplary acquisition.
Yeah.
And I think that went to Fred's head.
Well, yeah, I wondered that because I'm going to come to talk about the role of business schools and observers and the role that they've played in terms of defining or shaping the organisation culture. But it did set up a spree after that of further acquisitions, including some such as Angel Trains in Belgium, that were unrelated to what you might call kind of business or banking.
Yes.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the kind of assumption was at the top levels within RBS that because the the NatWest acquisition had been such a success that it almost didn't matter how much you paid for an acquisition, you could make up for the lost ground subsequently in terms of how you handled the integration, and in terms of cost savings and additional revenue generation. So, there was a mindset within RBS that Fred Goodwin was this genius in terms of banking integration, and therefore they could carry on making acquisitions ad infinitum. And I need to double check this, but I think they made about 27 between NatWest and ABN AMRO. Some were quite small, but some were quite big, like First Active in Ireland, like Churchill Insurance, like Bank von Ernst in Switzerland, and Charter One in the US, and Bank of China, the percentage, the equity stake in that. So, it fueled an acquisition frenzy almost, and this was also partly perhaps driven by Merrill Lynch, where Matthew Greenberg was the trusted advisor who advised on all these deals. And there is a view, and I'm not sure how fair it is, that he basically was egging Fred on to do a lot of these deals because he was making, or his bank and he personally were making, an absolute fortune from the acquisition frenzy.
Because that's a lot of acquisitions. I mean, that probably is about right, 27 or so many within those number of years between NatWest and ABN AMRO. It's a huge amount, it's at least a few a year. That's kind of to look at.
And I think the trouble is you can't, one's eye. Well, you could argue that his eye must have been off the ball a bit because he was obsessing about the Gogarburn development. Until that was completed in 2005, and a lot of the sports sponsorship thing side, or a lot of the sports sponsorship that he was heavily engaged with were potentially also taking his eye off the ball. So the idea that he could have actually focused as much attention on each of these deals as he did with NatWest was not realistic.
And Gogarburn opened in 2005 by the late Queen.
Yes,
and with a Formula One racing car that went round the whole of the building.
I know,
very fast speed, which was incredibly scary, I think.
Yes.
What's your view about Fred then embedding the whole workplace culture? There's all these acquisitions going on. There's growth. Every year appearing in front of shareholders to show even more growth of RBS become bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yes.
More pressure to do that. how far did that, do you think, define the workplace culture inside the organisation?
Well, I think the case of First Active and Ulster Bank is quite telling because, Ulster Bank was a very traditional bank which existed in both Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland and was old, been around since the Victorian times. And suddenly they bolted on First Active, which was a much more aggressive mortgage outfit, and put the management of that in charge of the combined. They joined them together and put the First Active management in charge under Cormac McCarthy. But I think that's in some ways quite interesting because the culture was completely overturned in the space of a year or so, and it became a much more aggressive place. And they embarked on this so-called journey to one. So the idea was that having been about the fourth biggest bank in the island of Ireland, they would be the number one bank in the island of Ireland within I can't remember the number of years, like 3 or 4 years. But the only way you can do that is by having a reckless culture inside the bank, because you'll be lending. You want to make more loans. You want to do big loans to commercial property developers. And there was a bubble on, as you probably recall. So, yeah, the whole culture changed on a sixpence there. And that's maybe one example of that sort of quick cultural change.
Yes. And potentially an early warning sign about what was to come,
yes.
Perhaps in 2008.
Yes.
Just kind of staying on the same piece about the leadership, you refer in the book to that some observers regard his behaviour as psychopathic, and you talk about that in a kind of, well, he's psychopathic. It's a kind of shrug of the shoulders, well, that's just Fred. That's the way he works. What's your view on that?
I mean, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but so I can't judge really. I mean, if you look at the traits of a psychopath and if you look at the traits of a sociopath, it's definitely the case that Fred has some of these traits, or many of these traits. So, yeah, you could argue that that he certainly displays characteristics which are compatible with those personality types. A psychopath, I think, is much more cold and calculating, whereas a sociopath tends to be more sort of emotional and loses their rag more often. So personally, I think if he was to be put into one of those categories, I would put him in the sociopath category, but with some psychopath. It doesn't sound very kind or generous. Perhaps with some psychopathic characteristics as well.
Because of being so ruthless and being so cold and non-empathetic
yes.
to other people.
I think the lack of empathy is a key factor that I certainly built up over the course of my research, is that he rarely, I mean, there were occasions when he did empathize or even sympathize with people who were going through difficulties, but for the most part, he was pretty ruthless, and there was a lack of empathy or understanding of how bad his actions how badly they might affect the person who he was targeting.
Okay, let's move on to kind of what was it like inside the organisation? Because, back in 2005 when I joined the organisation, RBS was seen as, being on the global stage,
yes.
covering more than sort of like 30 countries, had business in 30 countries. They were also presented with many industry awards. And according to the annual engagement survey, had one of the highest levels of engagement, both in terms of the financial services benchmark, but also on a global companies benchmark as well. But you mentioned in the book, you say, well, these annual measurements of sort of staff feelings, for feeling, which talk about for feeling proud of working for the organisation.
Yes.
Also, the HR leader, Neil Roden, won a number of awards for being best HR leader.
I know.
As well. For a few years, and was presented with honorary doctorates and all sorts of things. You say it was pretty superficial, and I wonder if we could just explore that a bit more about.
Yeah, well, I don't really know enough about this, but I have been told that they were a bit like Zimbabwean.
You did mention
elections.
That. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So.
No offence to Zimbabwe.
I know. No. If well, I suppose a key question is: did the line managers see what individual staff members said?
No.
In their response.
No.
So it was completely.
It was completely confidential. Now, always in organisations, people worry they see, but what is now Willis Towers Watson, who run the survey during that period, they would rest that you can never see less than 5 respondents or 6 respondents. I can't remember what exactly they had, but that's always so you wouldn't know what an individual had said.
But were the response forms anonymous?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, I don't really know, but I mean, see, my understanding was there was a chance it would be seen by a more senior person, like a line manager or above that. So that's why I
not on an individual level. So you would see sort of scores overall, and those scores would also be then reflected in probably a table. So if you took branches, there would be a reflection of those. So people would see their overall scores against that, and that may have made individuals worried. But it was to see kind of transparently what was going on. So I think from the other piece, and actually I think there is an argument to say from the HR position, which said the rewards, the benefits and everything else, if you went kind of outside the kind of central mothership, if you like, actually probably felt okay. You were pretty well rewarded for the work you did. Maybe that piece was actually, those pieces worked quite well, but there was clearly a lot more tension as you got closer to the central line of power.
Yes.
To Fred.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I don't know about this engagement survey. I didn't realise it was done by Taz Watson.
Yes, it was an independent. It was never done internally.
Yes.
And it was analysed and hugely analysed on a global basis, looking at different countries, look at sort of like what motivated individuals. So it was a great source of data to mine to understand what really motivated people. So I think the will behind it, or the sense behind it, was to look at it in a very positive way around, well, what does this tell us year on year?
Yes.
But of course, you might say, well, people were encouraged. There was much more of this press office going out about how wonderful RBS was. So I talk in my book about cognitive dissonance. That's what's said on the outside doesn't always manifest what's going on inside.
Yes.
But there was a real sense of, particularly with winning awards, which I think also led to this sense of, why not do more acquisitions? Why not do that? Because if somebody has also been knighted in the years preceding 2008, it says everybody thought that, this person was described by me, by colleagues. Fred was described as having the brain size of the planet, which then ended up being the brain size of the universe, which was amazing. So very hard to challenge that, right?
Yes, I think that's right. I think there was definitely a cult of Fred inside the bank.
Yeah.
And I actually got a quote about that. I mean, I don't know how relevant this is, but basically after that happened, after he was put on Forbes, the Global Business Magazine front cover, and named as Global Business Leader of the Year, 2003, he changed. He changed basically overnight. And in the case of Goodwin, one former senior advisor to the Royal Bank of Scotland says, and this was a board-level advisor, says Fred literally thought he was walking on water after that article. Before, people like me found him relatively easy to speak to. Afterwards, he cut himself off. The real arrogance came in after that. He only wanted to mix with the most senior bankers, the governor of the Bank of England, prime ministers, presidents, and members of the royal family, and of course the Scottish great and the good who wanted to touch Fred's cloth. But this was a dangerous frame of mind for the chief executive, I write. This was a dangerous frame of mind for the chief executive of FTSE 100 listed firm, especially one with a semi-detached chairman as unfortunately George Mathewson was, and whose directors were in his thrall, as they definitely were. There were early signs of a so-called cult of Fred developing inside the bank, with the messages and iconography honed to perfection by communications director Howard Moody. Fred was gradually being transformed from a gauche, bespectacled geek into a confident and assured global leader.
Yes. So the cult of Fred.
Yeah.
And Forbes magazine has a lot to answer for, in your view, then, around that picture on. And Forbes has been, noteworthy over the years of putting business leaders. I mean, they put on John Stumpf in 2012, I think it was.
Yes.
Who subsequently, on CEO of Wells Fargo, suddenly sued, and
yes, I remember that.
And he now can no longer work in financial services. So Forbes magazine, that picture, you think really perhaps went to Fred's head? Well,
I mean, this guy is one of the most senior city advisors to the Royal Bank of Scotland. He says that. But they do have this thing called the cover curse, which I also mention in this chapter, which is, normally within 6 months the firm is bust or the man's been fired. Or the woman, I suppose it could be a woman. Yeah, here we go. I spoke to a guy who actually wrote the article inside Forbes, which was incredibly unctuous about how great Fred Goodwin was. And he said, inside Forbes, the editorial team always used to wonder whether someone featured on the cover would succumb to the so-called cover curse, meaning they would start to believe their own PR, become hubristic, and make bad business decisions.
Oh, wow. That says a lot, doesn't it? Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a story there around looking for toxic organisations, is to look at who's on the front cover of Forbes magazine by the sounds of it.
I'm sure some of them are fine. I'm sure, there are some who ride it out and are fine, but I think it did go to Fred's head.
Yes. Okay. Let's turn to now the role, because I want to talk about the followers. So we talked about the engagement survey, and everything seems to be relatively satisfactory or happy within measuring it on the engagement survey. But business schools, and when I talk about susceptible followers, I talk about those that are not just, it's the language that's used in academia, but the followers are potentially susceptible would be those that conform, do somebody's bidding, but also those that collude. And I wonder what your view is on business schools, because you mentioned earlier about Masters of Integration, which I always thought was some irony. I think that was written in 2000 by Harvard. Was that Harvard or London Business School?
No, I think that was slightly later. I think it was about 2003.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was Harvard Business School that wrote it.
Yeah, and then there was a latter one around entitled The Strategy of Not Having a Strategy, with some irony, and that was just published, I think, the year before the global financial crisis.
And that was also Harvard Business School, was it?
Yeah, and London Business School also wrote a number of articles as well, which were, you used the word adulatory. Yes, you used that word. So I wonder what your view is on the business schools that wrote those articles. Were they just drinking the Kool-Aid?
Probably. I mean, if you're quite cynical about it, you could say that when that article was published in 2003, Fred Goodwin was going to have Royal Bank of Scotland was going to have a Harvard Business School on its site. The plan when they built and designed that business school was for it to be run by Harvard, or at least be branded Harvard Business School. So you could suggest that there was some kind of commercial link there between RBS and Harvard Business School, which may have skewed their judgment.
Interesting, because Harvard Business School did come and run a number of senior management and executive programs at the business school. And as you'll know, the business school was completely modelled, as the building, with the auditorium, exactly as if you were in Harvard.
Yeah, my memory of it is that they were originally literally going to have it as Harvard Business School, as a outpost of HBS on the Gogarburn campus, but that was dropped and they decided to run it themselves. So maybe that was a possibility. I mean, I think there was a lot. There was a lot of possible misinformation and a lot of spin around, as I mentioned earlier, around how wonderful the integration of NatWest had been, and that it was the model for all banking integrations. And Fred Goodwin was some kind of genius because he had pulled this off. And I think they certainly went along in the same direction with their article. And it was written by Nitin Noria,
yes,
who's
Mr.
the dean of the business school. And I would argue that they didn't do their research. They didn't do enough research. There were aspects that were well known there were aspects of that integration which were well known not to have been as successful as they claimed in their article.
Yes.
So I think it was a major failure on the part of Harvard Business School.
Yeah, thank you. I think when you've got that, you've got a leader that was knighted during this period. We've got business schools externally applauding Fred Goodwin. We've got he's on the front cover of Forbes magazine. So from business journalists, if you're inside the organisation, and you're as an employee, quite hard to have your voice heard then with all of that going on in terms of that wider environment.
Yes, and
not necessarily a culture of fear, but a culture where you may want to kind of pick your battles. Yes.
I mean, the other thing that happened around that time is he was given an honorary degree by the University of St Andrews, my alma mater. And there was awards being showered on Fred Goodwin at that time, including being made an honorary wing commander of the Royal Air Force.
I did not know that, really.
Yes. So, all these things.
Was he a pilot? He could fly? I don't know.
No, but he used to, I mean, it's in the book, but he managed to arrange to go to Lucas, which was still a fully fledged RAF airbase, Cold War airbase, and go up in, would it be a Eurofighter Tornado? I actually don't know which are, one of these fast fighter jets, but in the navigator's seat, which is the second seat behind the pilot, and they used to do loop the loops and all sorts of things. He went up there because he loved speed. Fred Goodwin absolutely loved speed, and you can't go faster than in one of those jets.
Yes.
And I think it was that was definitely linked to the fact that he became an honorary. It may be the wrong rank, but he certainly became something like an honorary wing commander in the Royal Air Force.
Wow. Okay. Let's know. That's interesting around all of that. So there's all of this, massive kind of applause that's going on. How amazing the leader is for the organisation. And let's talk about the conducive environment, the third part of the toxic triangle, the conducive. Because you talk in your book, you spend quite a bit of time talking about performance management.
Yes.
And what is known as the rank and yank performance management is the same approach. It was built from GE, used it, adopted it many years ago. Lloyds Bank, we were just talking off air, we were saying, Lloyds Bank have just implemented the rank and yank. Kind of interesting, 20 years after organisations have been dropping rank and yank.
It's quite odd because Sir Brian Pittman, who was the former chairman of Lloyds Bank, Lloyds before it merged with HBOS, so it's still called Lloyds TSB, he, in the book, I quote him as criticising any performance management system which is dependent on making sales, on selling loans.
Yes,
he says it's insane.
Well, let's talk about the rank and yank system, because it's not just sales. So what it does is actually rate employees according usually to 5 boxes. Sometimes it's 6, but and it depends on the organisation. Let's say 5 is your highest, the kind of the superstars. 3 is the kind of satisfactory. You're doing your job. You're competent. 2 or 1. 2 you need to improve, and 1 maybe you're not performing in the role you're in.
Yes.
The rank and yank also then uses what is a bell-shaped curve, kind of almost like accountants, to kind of figure out that vast majority of stuff are going to be 3, doing their job competently and satisfactorily. But all the evidence shows that when a rank and yank performance system is put in, and this predates, you cite in the book, Deming, you cite it leads to bad behaviours, sharp elbows, and individually I need to get this piece. And all the evidence shows as well that people who tend to get the lower ratings are the new recruits, new people coming in, so they can fit the bell-shaped curve, part-timers, mainly women, and maybe some of those that are even on sick leave. So it skews really what is there. People play with that system.
Yes.
How far do you think this contributed to what we talked about earlier, to this potentially sort of toxic workplace culture? You said there were aspects. How far do you think it contributed into?
I think it definitely contributed to it. I first became aware of that rank and yank system within RBS, which is, as you say, is modelled on General Electric, Jack Welch's General Electric, through one senior manager within the private banking wealth management side. And he thought it was iniquitous. He thought it was actually having a negative effect on people's performance. And so he really introduced it to me. And then I did some more research and found out, what Phil Taylor had said, what Deming had said, and what other people had said about rank and yank in general. Or I think Phil Taylor was specifically looking at the RBS one alongside certain other financial services ones. But I think it encourages, as you say, sharp elbows, a very competitive internal environment. And I think the managing to the curve is one of the key problems. So as you say, they're trying to get, they've got this bell curve and they're trying to make sure there are enough people in different segments. So that can mean someone could get marked down and therefore potentially lose their job, because the bottom 10% are the ones who traditionally are fired. Just not through them being bad at their job, but just because someone's chosen to manage to the curve and put them in the lowest ranking.
It's interesting, that narrative, because that is kind of how that would work on bell. So RBS was actually using a bell-shaped curve that skewed more towards the positive end, with a narrative that went behind that said, well, anybody working at RBS is going to be really good anyway, so we need to recognise that. So even using that rank and yank, yes, it was there, and it was sort of under the surface. I mean, many organisations, and I think we talked earlier that RBS, or now NatWest, have moved away from that, and they're much more focused on future development, training, and an investment in talent, as opposed to performance management that really is marking last year's performance. So many organisations have moved away from that.
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know how relevant it is, but Donald Mackenzie, who was a manager in the West End branch in
Yes.
Edinburgh, he using that system, as far as I'm aware, he was ranked as Business Manager of the Year 3 years running, because he was making such good, he was lending so much money to small and medium-sized enterprises. But it turned out that actually he was a criminal, and he was actually making companies, or creating companies, shell companies, to lend to, just so he could achieve the volumes of new loans which were required for him to be in the top echelon. So the Donald Mackenzie case is quite interesting. He actually went to jail for that.
Yes, I know that case. Yeah. So I mean, it was millions that were fraudulently lent out, around that period of time, and so somebody manipulating a system in that way. Yes, and I think he was also awarded, because I think you put in the book, Branch Manager of the Year across all the branches throughout the UK. But
isn't that quite
irony.
Soul destroying for the others if they then think this guy actually achieved that through crime?
Yes. It was devastating, I think. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So performance management, the rank and yank system, there's There's also this sense of, and just go touch back on this sense of deference to, and I partly when I was thinking around this period in the noughties, the zeros, was a lot of the business schools, a lot of the books that were coming out were pretty much about one great leader. The leadership theory was you need to wait for this one, they're going to come over the horizon, they're going to change everything, wait for them, they're going to have a vision, they've got to have a vision, and it's, as I was looking at that, there's an academic in Ireland, Dennis Turish, who wrote about how the dark side of transformational leadership, and around actually when you start to think about that, why are we listening to this? Why would it not be a more collaborative view or vision for the future?
Yes.
And I just wonder if that kind of also in that context had a sense that allowed Fred to be able to control and manage and lead in the way he did.
I think so. I mean, I think his predecessor as chief executive was George Matheson, and I think he was a more collegiate leader. He inspired much greater confidence amongst his immediate reports. I mean, not everything he did was perfect, but he certainly was a more collegiate leader than Fred. Fred Goodwin preferred to, as you say, be the sort of almost the Atlas Shrugged type leader who is sort of put on a pedestal and doesn't necessarily share ideas or consult very widely with his colleagues. That's the impression I get, and I don't think it is healthy. I mean, I think if that was the thesis, the business school thinking in the 2000s, that you need a leader like that, I think they were wrong.
Yes, and I wonder how much that's also, we're going to talk about in a little while about how that sort of led maybe to what's going on in politics in 2025.
Yes.
I just want to come to kind of the piece around when I looked at toxic workplace cultures, they don't happen overnight. That's the kind of whole theories. And I talk about 4 stages of a toxic workplace culture. And it's based on 2 kind of main driving sort of factors. One is cognitive dissonance. What you say on the outside is often different what you say, externally. So there's a kind of difference there. It's a psychological term around that. And then this kind of normalization of deviance that, over time, what was a risk early on becomes, and it's so drawn around normalization of deviance. So the kind of the first stage around will be you get incivility, you get rudeness, you get abruptness, or and then it moves through these different. So a normalization and a poor behaviour. That's just Fred.
Yes.
That's just Jane. That's what they do. So, and policies may well get applied very differently depending on who you are and where your standing is in the organisation.
Yes.
To the last stage, which I'd kind of describe as being more of a cult, and you called about a cult of Fred. And I wonder where, put you on the spot a little bit, Ian, if I might.
Yeah.
So where would you have put RBS in that stages of a toxic workplace culture?
I think I put it in the erosion of psychological safety category. People don't dare to speak out, and I think groupthink is a big thing here. The cult of Fred and groupthink means that basically no one challenges things. People don't dare challenge things because they know they could be shot down for challenging it. I mean, one guy I know challenged the ABN AMRO takeover because he knew it would be a disaster, especially after LaSalle was removed. And, he basically then was frozen out by Fred Goodwin. So, and he effectively lost his job and had a mental breakdown. So when people stop speaking out or against the leader, as seems to have happened at RBS, apart from these one or two occasions, that one of which I referred to, I think that's the stage that RBS had got to by ABN AMRO. Yes,
and the consequences of speaking out, the consequences you just described, horrific for that individual.
Yes, it's damaged him ever since. Really, it's been hugely damaging.
So more broadly, And this is something where financial institute every year in annual reports, and banks will say, we have speak up, people can speak up, and this is what we do. And you can just put into an anonymous email inbox, or you can speak up in a way.
Yeah, but actually they don't.
But they don't. So I mean, there's a sort of failure, is there really, in financial institutions of being able to.
Yeah, well, there are two major whistleblowers who I quote in my book, and one of them is Ron de Breber, who worked in RBS's investment bank in 2002, and he warned about CDOs, particularly the way they were being structured. And he said if RBS carried on structuring its CDOs in that way, it would be bust within 5 years. Guess what? It was. But because he spoke out, he was fired. Well, he certainly was eased out. I don't know if he was technically fired, but he was eased out of his job. And another guy, Victor Hong, who was managing director of risk management at RBS Greenwich Capital in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a huge part of RBS, which basically bundled toxic piles of debt and then sold them on or retained them on the balance sheet. And he warned he warned his superiors about the markdowns on CDOs in November 2007, and it said he basically they were refusing to mark them down to their true value because they knew this was RBS Greenwich Capital. They knew if they did mark them down to their true value, they wouldn't get a bonus for 2007. And so he wasn't fired. He resigned, but in a letter to the finance director of RBS's investment bank, he explained his reasons. He didn't want to incriminate himself by signing off false valuations on CDOs. So these are just examples of people who did speak out and suffered for it. They both lost their jobs, and the bank just refused to listen to the warnings they issued.
Well, let's come to the consequences now, actually, of the RBS story, and lessons learned. I wanted to mention, we talked just off air about the kind of Make It Happen, the new play by James Graham that was premiered in Edinburgh in August this year and is due to go to London in 2026. And
that's great news.
Yeah, James, so really, RBS, really important story for Scotland, but for the UK. And we've seen probably the rise since the global financial crisis. We've seen the rise. We were talking earlier about Brexit, about austerity, and even in nationalism. I mean, what's your view about what have we learned as a nation from what happened with the global financial crisis and with RBS?
I don't think we learnt enough. I mean, I think it was a time, when RBS and other banks failed in 2007 to 2009. I think, it was a time to take stock and reconsider our approach to regulating the financial sector, or, reconsider the scale of some of these banks. Should they be broken up? So unfortunately, you had a prime minister and a chancellor of the exchequer at that time, Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, whose attitude was, let's just stick a Band-Aid on this, and we'll give them X billion pounds, and then they can just get back to business as usual. There was no real attempt to reform the culture, and it was a missed opportunity because that was definitely the time when it could have happened, in my view.
What would you have done if you'd been Prime Minister? What would you have done to reform the culture? Well,
I think one of the things which I agree with Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, on is they should have let RBS fail. They could have ring-fenced the UK retail and commercial bank, but they could have actually put everything else into an orderly resolution process, form of administration. And that's what Stiglitz feels, and I think he's right. I think they should have done that. what else would I have done? I think maybe, they could have reinvented RBS as potentially as a series of more regional banks, which are more, closer to their customers. What else?
You were talking earlier about Handelsbanken.
Yeah.
And their approach. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Handelsbanken is a Swedish bank which has become quite large in the UK, and they're even advertising on Times Radio now. And I think, the last time I looked, they had about 120 branches, but they probably have more. And I am actually a customer, I have to say. But basically, they have a much more sensible or sane approach to banking, in my view, and they will almost winding the clock back to pre-90s, whereby branch managers have more autonomy, and they don't pay any bonuses to any banker. So it's a system which seems to work. Trouble with bonuses is they do tend to inspire bad behavior. You're getting a huge bonus for doing a particular deal or a particular selling a particular product or financial instrument to your customers or to your counterparties, but you're normally thinking about how great the bonus is going to be from selling this thing than you are about the long-term welfare of the customer. So I think a lot of bonuses a lot of the way in which bankers are incentivized is damaging. And I'm very interested in the Handelsbanken model, where, as I say, they don't pay any bonuses to any member of staff.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. So we should follow Handelsbanken more closely, actually.
Yes.
And just when you look back, I've got one last question, but maybe just an opportunity for you to say, is there anything that you think in terms of, as we've gone through Shredded, or is there anything kind of you felt that you would have liked to have said, during our podcast that you've not had an opportunity to do so?
Yes. Well, I do think, one of the worst things that happened at RBS was the rights issue of April 2008, when it was already running pretty low on capital, and Hector Sanz, who was then the chief executive of the Financial Services Authority, more or less forced the RBS board to do a rights issue to boost their capital ratios. And they did do it, and they successfully raised £12 billion, almost all of which was lost 5 months later, or several months later, when the bank collapsed in October of 2008. So I think, to me, this was one of the worst things that RBS has ever done, because they made a lot of their staff buy shares in the rights issue, and or encouraged or coerced their staff to invest in the rights issue. And I think it was, if not deceptive, possibly even fraudulent, because they did not put in sufficient detail of the financial difficulties that they were in, or the fact they were already taking clandestine, huge amounts of clandestine support from the Federal Reserve in the States. That wasn't in there. So the prospectus that they issued, which persuaded their investors to put the money in at £2 a share back in April to June 2008, was a travesty. And I think that's it. That's the area where if anyone did want to try to prosecute senior bankers for criminal behaviour, that's one area where the UK could have done so if it had the appetite.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Okay.
And I just wonder, actually, as you were talking about that, like, who's on your watch list for, toxic workplace cultures, in 2026? Do you have a sense? We talked the positive about Handelsbanken, that seems.
I'd like to write about more positive cultures like Handelsbanken, or maybe Greg's. I don't know if you know the chain of
I know the sausage roll.
sausage rolls and the chain Greggs, which sells basically a lot of different types of food and coffee and things. Apparently, they have a very interesting approach to rewarding staff, and I'd like to look into that a bit more about how the Greggs system works.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. We should do that. We want to talk more about what's working out there, and that everybody should be able to come to work and feel that they've had a really good day.
And I do think it's also of interest that Paul Thwaite, who's the new chief executive of RBS, who took over from Alison Rose in 2023, has introduced a new system called NatWest Beyond, and it is about rewarding good behaviour, but it seems to be a lot more. Well, you've seen this, haven't you? It seems to be infinitely preferable to me anyway to the system which they had under Neil Roden.
It's a conversation about the future and about potential, and and I think it's a base. From all the research shows that as human beings, we want to grow, we want to learn, we want to continuously do this throughout our life. So it kind of builds on that system about focus on the future, on development, and how you can be a better version of yourself.
Yes, I mean, I do think one of the things I do say in the book is that there's a problem with capitalism, which is that a listed company, like most banks are, according to Milton Friedman, writing in the 70s, and he still believed, is, the sole purpose of that enterprise is to enrich its own shareholders. I think it's evolving now, but the trouble is, if that is literally going to be your sole purpose as an enterprise, as a corporation, to enrich your own shareholders, there is a real danger that things like we've seen at RBS, particularly with the Global Restructuring Group episode, it will happen because basically, if your sole purpose is to enrich your shareholders, you don't really care if you're going to fleece your customers. You don't really care if you're going to trash the environment. You don't really care if you're going to harm society because, ultimately, your purpose is to enrich the shareholders. So I think we need people talked a lot about stakeholder capitalism back even in the 90s, but I'm not sure if we've really got there yet.
No, we haven't got there yet. So, let's leave that on the note of stakeholder capitalism. But I just want to say thank you so much. Very informative, thorough, in-depth, honest account of what happened during the RBS years of Shredded, from 2000 to 2008, the global financial crisis, and lessons learned. So, Ian, big thank you.